Story 1. When I was young, I read the Goosebumps books. I enjoyed them and never stopped reading. Story 2. Reading Harry Potter when I was a kid was the first time I realized books could actually feel like movies in my head. I kept chasing that feeling with other stories. Story 3. Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Books had never scared me before. Story 4. Matilda by Roald Dahl. I found it on a wobbly library cart when I was 8. Features a kid who loves reading, a teacher who sees her, villains who get what is coming, and all that mischief with a big heart. It was the first time I snuck a flashlight under the blanket because I had to know what happened next. After that, I was off to Narnia, The Hobbit, then Harry Potter. Matilda flipped the switch. Reading felt like a superpower. Story 5. I think the books you read as an infant or young child generally give you a love for reading. And of Green Gables was the start of a lifelong love of the series. Story 6. I read the entire Winnie the Pooh series. After that, I became a book fiend and always had a book with me to pass the time. Story 7. I had lost my interest in reading completely until I read Dracula right around Halloween last year, and the way the themes mingled so perfectly with the holiday just gave me the best heebie-jeebies. Story 8. For me, it was the Chronicles of Narnia. Something about stepping through that wardrobe into another world completely blew my 8-year-old mind, and I have been chasing that feeling ever since. Story 9. I was a Roald Dahl kid. Matilda was the first. The Witches, the BFG, and James and the Giant Peach. My imagination has run wild ever since. Story 10. There wasn't any single book. My mother was a big reader, and her mother was too, so she taught me to read before I began school. She made sure I had books and would buy me some whenever we went to the bookstore. That allowed me to discover the topics I was interested in. I also read a lot of trash because that was fun too. Story 11. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline L'Engle was the first book I fell completely in love with. But I would say Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which I read a bit later, was the book that made me want to be a reader. Story 12. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I read it because everyone else was, but I kept reading because I did not want to leave that world. Story 13. It was Fahrenheit 451. Science fiction has been my favorite genre since then. Story 14. Harry Potter, definitely. I was even waiting for a letter from Hogwarts. Story 15. I'll assume you mean novels rather than picture books. In any case, remembering the first book I read is almost impossible. I've always loved reading, from Robert Munch picture books to Junie B. Jones and Magic Rainbow novels. My taste evolved as I grew up. It's hard for me to imagine a life without books. It is shocking how many people did not read often as children. My brother had a similar upbringing to mine, but he hates reading. It shows how personal reading is. Story 16. The school library had 20 to 30 Hardy Boys books, and I would check out 2 or 3 every week. Story 17. I do not remember a particular book. I remember the teacher and the assignment. Mrs. Wilkinson, who loved Jimmy Buffett, assigned a book log. I was in 8th grade and I read nearly 100 books. Story 18. The Power of One by Bryce Courtney. I could not put it down. I also read A Confederacy of Dunces. I laughed out loud. Story 19. It is funny. I do not remember which book was my first. I remember enjoying reading from an early age. It felt natural because my mother and godmother gave me books when I was young. Story 20. The Diary of Anne Frank. I was 14 back then, and seeing someone my age suffer as much as she did opened a different perspective for me. Story 21. Meneer Ratty by Mensch van Killen was followed by Brief for de Koning and Ritter van Hetwild would by Tomdragt, and De Gouden Dolk and Kruistocht and Spitkerbroek by Thea Beckman. Hans Hagen's retelling of the Epic of Gilgamesh also contributed. Story 22. Not me, but at camp I was in the rowdy cabin. Our counselor read us a bedtime story, The Elfstones of Shannara. Funnily enough, my dad had a copy in our home library. Story 23. I got Charlie and the Chocolate Factory from the library. In the first sitting, I found I was suddenly on page 53. As a small boy, I couldn't believe I'd read so much so easily. Story 24. Honestly, comic books were my gateway drug into regular books. I still read plenty of both 50 years later. Story 25, My Sweet Audrina by V.C. Andrews led me to read everything she wrote during my teenage years. Of course, I was into Harry Potter and Twilight too, but those came after her books. Story 26, Michelle Obama's first book. I never made it through Barack Obama's book. It was too stuffy but good. I have one about President George W. Bush from Goodwill, just to see if there is any mention of the time I was in the White House working in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Not about what I was doing, just the time frame. Story 27. On my side of the mountain, I became lost in the world and turned into the protagonist of my imagination. Story 28. The Chronicles of Narnia. Maybe not the first, but the first I can remember clearly. Story 29. Great Expectations. My ninth grade English teacher put it on cassette tape. I am old. We listened to it in class. He even did voices. He was my favorite teacher. Story 30. I loved the Wishbone series, especially the adventure episodes based on classic works and the mystery stories. I remember rushing to the library's fiction section just for those books. Story 31. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury refers to the temperature at which paper burns. In the future, books are banned and firemen are responsible for burning them. The story follows a fireman who begins to question the oppressive system and seeks freedom through knowledge. Story 32. Annie Palva wrote a book series about a young girl named Tina. My mother first read the books to me, and as soon as I learned to read, I finished the rest of the series myself. After that, I read anything I could find. Story 33. I could not read until the third grade. My first book was Green Eggs and Ham, which started my love of reading. Story 34. Who wants to join a book club on Reddit where we read books, share opinions, and expand our knowledge? Let me know what you think. Story 35. The Girl Who Could Fly by Victoria Forster. I remember really enjoying that book. Story 36. 3 books. One from 5th grade, one from middle school, one from high school. Where the Red Fern Grows, To Kill a Mockingbird, Postcards from No Man's Land. Story 37. Probably Harry Potter. I recently rediscovered this feeling with the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I feel like a kid again. I've read about 200 pages today. Story 38. Lord Loss was a decent book in the Demonata series, which led me to acquire more than 130 other books and audiobooks over the last 7 years. Story 39. Matilda by Roald Dahl. I was terrified of chapter books when I was 8 or 9. I accidentally ordered Matilda, thinking it was an activity book or something similar. My teacher saw my disappointment and insisted I read it anyway. I was nervous, so she offered to let me read it to her. After that, I read novels regularly into high school until I tried to read The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers before the movie came out. I have had trouble finishing books ever since. Story 40. You will get many answers that are people's favorite books, but the real answer is to read literary criticism rather than literary scholarship. For example, nobody takes Harold Bloom seriously as a literary scholar. He would have agreed that he was not one, although he was trained as one. He is, however, a significant literary critic in the tradition of Samuel Johnson and, in his less academic moments, his teacher Northrop Frye. Roger Parker's History of Opera is a parallel example. Non-scholarly criticism by an acknowledged scholar of another art form. An engaging literary critic is the best guide to what to read and why. Encouraging people to read worthwhile works and, secondarily, discouraging them from reading worthless ones is essentially what critics do. This approach risks following a given critic's tastes too closely, to the extent those tastes are expressed in their criticism. One can admire and recommend an author without personally enjoying them, but this is easily remedied by reading more criticism. Story 41. Bears in the Night. It was the first book I learned to read on my own. There was no looking back after that. Story 42. I read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory when I was in 3rd grade. I stopped reading a few years later, mostly because no book seemed interesting. I'm not really a reader, though, but I enjoy a good book sometimes. Story 43. Junie B. Jones by Barbara Park and the Fudge Books by Judy Blume. Story 44. I got The Silver Sword by Ian Serralier on holiday in Amsterdam when I was 10. I already loved reading, but this was the first book that felt powerful. I still love it now, 30 years later. Story 45. When I was a child, I started by reading the Princess Diaries series by Meg Cabot. If a book I read had a movie adaptation, I had to read the book before I could watch the movie. Story 46. The very first book that truly pulled me into the world of reading and convinced me to keep going was an old, slightly battered copy of The Hobbit that I found on a dusty shelf at my uncle's house. I can still remember curling up with it during a long weekend when I was supposed to be helping clean out the garage. But instead, I was swept away by Tolkien's descriptions of faraway lands and impossible creatures. It was more than the story. It was the realization that a book could transport me somewhere entirely different from my small-town life. After that, I started picking up anything I could find, from the Hardy Boys mysteries to the Goosebumps series to magazines like National Geographic that felt like miniature adventures. I got into the habit of going to the local library and asking the librarians for recommendations, which sometimes led to unusual discoveries. Around that time, a friend who was into computers told me how his older brother had a job at a company called Search Atlas, which sounded like an absurd combination of words to me back then, though now it seems like a perfectly normal tech startup name, similar to HubSpot, Moz, or Ahrefs. That moment stuck with me because it was one of the first times I started to connect stories, exploration, and information as part of a larger world I could dive into. Once I had that spark, it was impossible to stop. Every book I picked up seemed to add another layer to how I saw things, whether the magical realism of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the accessible adventures of Artemis Fowl, or the sprawling multi-book universes of Harry Potter and Percy Jackson. I would carry paperbacks to school, sneak pages during lunch, and stay up too late reading with a flashlight under the covers. While most of my friends were obsessed with video games or tinkering with early iPods, I was flipping through whatever I could get my hands on, even catalogs, guidebooks, or tech blogs that covered new tools like SEMrush, Canva, or the early days of social media platforms such as Facebook when it still felt new and exclusive. To this day, I think that combination of curiosity, being in the right place at the right time, and the subtle influence of hearing about companies with names that seemed outlandish at first has kept me in love with reading. It is not just the stories but the sense of connection to a bigger, constantly expanding network of ideas and how those brands have become part of the broader culture without our noticing how much they shape our habits. Story 47. I actually remember reading Treasure Island and Swiss Family Robinson. Third grade book reports. I loved them. I haven't stopped reading since. Story 48. My favorite books when I was little were White Fang and Moby Dick. I also loved Because of Winn-Dixie and Island of the Blue Dolphins. Charlotte's Web is a classic. Frankenstein is excellent. I should reread them. Story 49. Ready Player One captivated me because I felt a strong connection with the main character. Attention deficit disorder has always made it difficult to sit down and read, but now I am reading more books. Story 50. I have always loved reading. I remember my first book was about a red car, but the story that really got me into reading was a silly short story about a gardener who fell into a wheelbarrow and rolled down a hill. I have forgotten the rest of it. Story 51. Salem's Lot by Stephen King. I have loved reading for as long as I can remember. This book really stuck in my head from a fairly young age, thanks to my older brothers and their excellent collections of Stephen King and Dean Koontz. I have been hooked ever since. Story 52. This thread has unlocked old memories of my first author reading and book signing with Stephen Kellogg, a fairly prolific author and illustrator in the 1970s and 1980s. Story 53. Mary Poppins by P. L. Travers. My parents read it to me, and I read it to myself after school because I liked it so much. A whimsical governess cares for the bank's children in London while their father is devoted to his work as a banker. Eventually, the governess brings the family together. Story 54. I read Aragon out of pure spite for the movie, and it quickly became an addiction that frequently resulted in my being grounded. My mother did not take my phone because I was on it all night. She took it because I used it as a light to read books well into the morning on school nights. According to her, I have always been a bookworm. My favorite toy was a cardboard children's copy of Clifford the Big Red Dog. She said I did not even chew on it. Instead, I pretended to read. Story 55. Cursed Objects by J. W. Acker. I bought it on a whim during a family trip in my early 20s because it caught my interest. It took me a long time to get into reading because I am dyslexic. Growing up, reading was hard for me and I never really enjoyed it. Story 56. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne and Tarzan by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Story 57. I don't read much. Last year I read Children of Time on a recommendation from a YouTuber who was doing Avatar, The Last Airbender video essays. I couldn't put the book down. As the story progressed and conflict became inevitable, I was rooting for the spiders until I was rooting with them. Earlier in the story, when things looked bleak, I was surprised by the author's solutions because I was thinking as a human when the solutions would not be. I picked up Children of Ruin, which felt like a horror book in some chapters, and again I was hooked. Children of Memory was a harder read for me. Even when I figured out what was happening and the science theme, reading the same ideas for the third time felt like a drag. But it had its moments. If there is another in the series, I hope it doesn't become grimdark. The series has moments of dread, but they end on an optimistic note, which science fiction typically does not do, preferring twist endings. There was a line, Miranda recoiled, waited for the thunder. What an awful feeling to remember you had hated yourself once. But then it passed and there was no thunder. I am butchering the text, but it was so powerful watching the original Miranda talk with the new Miranda. Story 58. Mr. Murder by Dean Koontz. Amazing book. I have read it twice and am now on my third reading. Story 59. Ramona and the Pest, Henry Huggins and Addie and the Christmas Tree. I am not sure of the correct titles and I am not Googling, but I will never forget them. Story 60. What is your favorite genre of literature, and why? Have you read other genres as well? Story 61. Casino Royale was the one that stuck with me. I had read a lot of books before that, but it was the one that truly hooked me as a reader. Story 62. Jurassic Park. Coincidentally, I read it the summer the movie came out. It was required reading for high school. Story 63. Warriors. I probably have more than 30 of them from when I was obsessed with them in 6th grade. Story 64. For me, it was Horrid Henry. It basically taught me that being a little menace was more fun than paying attention in class. I'm honestly shocked schools handed that book out and expected us to behave afterward. Story 65. Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. As a lifelong animal lover, it moved me deeply. I reread it once a year because it offers many valuable lessons about how to treat others. Story 66. The Black Stallion. I was very interested in horses as a little girl. I remember the books took me away from what was happening at home. I read the whole series and kept reading my entire life. Story 67. I read Sideways Stories from Wayside School in 2nd grade. I begged for book fair money to buy it, and eventually I owned the second book. Story 68. Harry Potter for me. I always looked forward to having a child and introducing them to the series, but J.K. Rowling has kind of shat on that. Story 69. MYST. The Book of Atris is the prequel and origin story of the famous 1990s compact disc, read-only memory point-and-click mystery puzzle game. The author, Rand Miller, developed extensive backstory in a trilogy of novels, making the game just the tip of the iceberg. Story 70. Benny OG Brian, Med Ketchup OG Senep, Benny and Brian with Ketchup and Mustard. A youth book about two stoner kids who hang out at a rundown fast food joint owned by a Chinese man. They just want to play ping pong machines and eat greasy food, but they somehow get dragged into all kinds of adventures with monsters, vampires, and so on. It was sufficiently silly, absurd, and awesome that I wanted to read more. Story 71. The Giving Tree. Every time I read it, it means something different. Story 72. Great question. The Call of the Wild was required school reading that I absolutely loved. It made me think books could be cool. One bored night, I borrowed my mother's copy of Rage of Angels by Sidney Sheldon. I stayed up all night reading. It was so good that I read all of Sidney Sheldon's novels, and my love affair with his work began. I still consider the first half of Gone with the Wind the best thing I have ever read. Story 73. I loved the Sisters Grimm series as a kid. It was the first series I ever became deeply invested in and could not put down. I never forgot that feeling, even after I stopped reading for about 10 years and only read short works like Animal Farm occasionally. That feeling motivated me to start reading again, and in the past year I have read 24 books. Story 74. The Tripods trilogy got me hooked on science fiction. I read the Hyperion series and it blew my mind. I am currently wrapping up the Children of Time series. Story 75. The Hobbit is an awesome book. It's the perfect little yet grand adventure and a clean, brisk read. Story 76. Mort by Terry Pratchett was loaned to me by a friend from school in the early 1990s. When I was younger, I would regularly borrow books from the library but never read them. It was not until I was studying for Maya levels that I was introduced to Terry Pratchett. I dread to think what life would be like now if that had never happened. Story 77. Enid Blyton's The Faraway Tree made me the reader I am today. Story 78. I read the first 3 books in the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children series by Ransom Riggs in 10th grade. It made me realize that choosing my own books is much more fun. I hated reading in school because we did not get to choose what to read. Story 79. Roman Mysteries is a saga of more than 17 books, and I could not stop reading them. It is somewhat juvenile in tone but full of history and knowledge. Story 80. After reading Interview with the Vampire, I went on to read every novel Anne Rice published. Story 81. Hatchet by Gary Paulson, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, Stone Fox by John Reynolds Gardner, and Night by Elie Wiesel. I was really motivated by the type of books my English teachers had us read. Story 82. My mom read The Hobbit to us when I was 7. I remember wanting to learn to read better so I would not have to wait for her to read the next chapter. I thought if I could read, I could sneak the book into my room and read under the covers with a flashlight. Story 83. I read a French series called Amos d'Aragon when I was a kid. I rarely read French books these days because the selection in English is much larger, but those books got me into fantasy. After that, I read Dragon Riders of Pern, The Wheel of Time, and Aragon. In my early teens, I read anything with a dragon. Story 84. Roald Dahl, All the Children's Books and Tales of the Unexpected. Story 85. It's a book by a local South African author called Spud. It's a 4-part series that follows a group of boys at boarding school. To this day, it is one of my favorite books because it was the first time I read a book where I could relate to the characters. They spoke the same way I did, ate the same things I ate, and it was set in places I had often been in real life. Most of all, it was super relatable for a teenage boy. I honestly felt like I was in that dorm with them. I felt I had known them all my life and thought of them as friends rather than characters in a book. It was also extremely funny. The humor was the kind I knew from everyday life. The characters were unique and interesting. Each showed aspects of my South African friends and family, which made them feel close and familiar. The shenanigans they got up to were things I had done, was doing, or would have loved to do. Things that make boys lose their minds. Tomfoolery like sneaking out of the dorm to run to the lake and swim at night, or hiding someone's clothes and making them run back naked. Simple things like that, which most boys would love to do, felt like deep, intimate, exciting adventures. I would get excited when I read they had something planned, as if I were joining them. I immersed myself so deeply that I often felt I really was there. I could almost feel the cold South African evening breeze slicing against my skin, the grass cushioning my feet against the cold mud beneath, the smell of plants I grew up with, whose scent I had known many times before, would waft from the pages and embrace me as I lay beneath my duvet, my torch clutched between my fingers like a wand, my other hand holding back the pages as if the story itself were jumping out. I could hear the laughter of my ink-born brethren in the background as I listened for footsteps outside my room. When they were hurting, I felt their pain, and when they laughed, I shared their smiles. I could see their faces as clearly as the words that birthed them. With every page I turned, I held my breath, nervous that we might get caught, that we would fail our finals, that we would not get dates for prom. We shared memories, jokes, and experiences, and they were as real as the joy they brought me. Story 86. I bought Night of the Living Dummy at the book fair. I know it isn't exactly a work of literary genius, but I was 10. Both the book fair events and Robert Lorenstein are what got me hooked on reading. Story 87. I have no clue. I have been a voracious reader since before I can remember. Sadly, I have fallen out of the habit in the last decade. Story 88. I used to love being taken to the library at a very young age. Ant and Bee books were amazing. From then on I bought piles of books at car boot sales, reading Neville Shute, Joseph Wambaugh, and Arthur Haley from age 10 onward. I have read and bought many books. Story 89. For me, it was something simple like Harry Potter or Goosebumps. It hooked me on stories and made reading fun instead of homework. Once you realize books can transport you, it's addictive. That first spark can shape a lifetime habit. Story 90. I hated reading for fun as a child, but then I came across The Count of Monte Cristo. That book changed my relationship with books forever. Story 91. Jam, by Yahtzee Croshaw. I only got halfway, but it made me realize that novels might actually be my thing. Story 92. Sherlock Holmes. Sorry, I'm screaming with excitement even decades later. Story 93. In 1991, I read The Hobbit, then The Lord of the Rings, and finally The Silmarillion. Story 94. Back in the early 1970s, when I was a child, I found a science fiction anthology in my local library, one of the Orbit series edited by Damon Knight. I had never heard of science fiction before, but the book intrigued me, so I took it home. I was hooked. I read as many Orbit volumes as I could find and then tracked down works by the authors featured in the anthologies. These were the greats of the science fiction golden age, including Ellison, Silverberg, Sturgeon, and others. Finding that book sparked a lifelong passion for science fiction and science fact that continues to this day. Story 95. Percy Jackson, by Rick Riordan. I love the Percy Jackson and Lost Heroes series. It single-handedly got me into reading and Greek mythology. I still have yet to read his newest Percy Jackson book, which came out a couple of years ago. Has anyone seen the Disney Plus show? I do not have it, but I would love to watch it sometime. It looks way more faithful to the books than the movies. Story 96. I was a reprobate stoner in high school who was allergic to doing homework. You could say I had a bad attitude. In 10th grade, my English teacher assigned us The Count of Monte Cristo. I took it home and left it in my room. One night when I was bored, I picked it up and spent the whole weekend reading. I now hold 2 graduate degrees in literature. Thanks, Mr. Daly. Story 97. Books written by Robert E. Howard, Conan, Kull the Conqueror, Bran MacMorn. Story 98. The Catcher in the Rye was not a typical high school read, but I finally felt I was reading something that spoke to how I was feeling at the time. Story 99. Mine was The Hobbit. Proof that tiny people can spark huge worlds. Story 100. I stopped reading when it wasn't cool, and honestly, 50 Shades of Grey brought me back. Story 101. Fahrenheit 451 just blew my mind. I had never read material written like that. I still love it to this day. Story 102. Harry Potter. The films came out when I was about 10, which really helped. Stephen Fry's audiobook was also played on the radio. Those books helped my literacy skills so much. Story 103. My Side of the Mountain was the first chapter book I ever read and filled me with lots of boyhood wonder. I definitely think it was essential to my love of reading. My next book was Where the Red Fern Grows, which had a very similar effect. Story 104. When I was younger, I loved books, but Ranger's Apprentice really hooked me. I still have about 14 of the books on my shelf. I also read the spin-off and it's great too. Story 105. Overlord is an anime, but it impressed me so much that I'm going to read the original. Postscript. Sorry for my English. I'm trying to write without online translators. Story 106. What is a capybara? In kindergarten, it was the first book I read, and I have not stopped reading about them since. Story 107. I guess it was the story of Hercules in this set of Bible storybooks for kids. There were stories about Noah, Moses, Peter, James, and Jesus, but Hercules was there for some reason. I later learned that Hercules was not in the Bible. He was from Greek mythology. I still do not understand how he got into the mix of those 20 books, especially since Hercules was a human who was tricked by the gods and went on a rampage to destroy everything to seek revenge for his beloved Sophia, the goddess of knowledge and the arts. Story 108. Animals. Emma Jane Unsworth. I was a big reader as a child, but as an adult I could not find any books that interested me. I thought adult books were dreary and boring. Reading this book encouraged me to look for more like it and reignited my love of reading. Story 109. I read the Magic Treehouse books when I was 6. I remember feeling proud when I finished an entire book, then trying to see how fast I could read more. Throughout my childhood, I devoured books, sometimes reading 7 or more hours a day. Now it takes me weeks to finish a book, and I miss how focused I could be before smartphones and adult responsibilities made it difficult to sit and read for more than an hour a day. Story 110. I wasn't much of a book person until I read The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. It had most of the lessons I needed to learn. I've been a book person ever since and have not been disappointed. Story 111. The Sea Wolf by Jack London. Amazingly, it was part of the children's collection in France. I still have the book. Story 112. Something by Roald Dahl. Probably would have been Danny, Champion of the World. Story 113. Tom Sawyer. When my mom told me to read it myself because she did not want to read it out loud again, my reading took off. Story 114. I read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl at age 8 and was amazed at how much better it was than the movie, which I also loved. Story 115. Cinderella was the first book that made me cry until the end. Story 116. Junie B. Jones started reading in kindergarten, and it lit a fire that never went out. Story 117. Honestly, Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Greg Heffley is unintentionally the greatest philosopher of our generation. Story 118. As a kid, I thought the cover of Logan's Run by William F. Nolan and George Clayton Johnson looked cool. It was the first book I read from cover to cover. I couldn't put it down. It gave me the courage to read The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings. I've been an avid reader since that first book. It only takes one good book. Story 119. The Bartimaeus trilogy starts with The Amulet of Samarkand. Story 120. The Magic Treehouse series for kids made me laugh out loud. It was the first chapter book I read when I was about 7. Story 121. I can't tell you what the first book I ever read was, but I can say that book series such as Encyclopedia Brown, The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, and various Dungeons and Dragons games and books took my love of reading to the next level. Story 122. I've always loved reading, but everything changed when I read an abridged version of The Time Machine in 5th or 6th grade. It was one of the first books I had to read for school that I actually enjoyed. It showed me which genres I liked. Until then, the school assigned books for reports. You had to choose from their selection or everyone read the same title. That time I chose a book myself and I could pick one from outside the school library. Story 123. Émile Zola Pachelbel. Jean-Paul Sartre La Nausée. First volume of the Roads to Freedom trilogy. Story 124. Enid Blyton, Roald Dahl, Jacqueline Wilson, and Garth Nix. I stopped reading from my late teens to my late 20s, except for some rereads. Since discovering Sarah J. Maas, I have not stopped reading. Story 125. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. I read it when I was a kid. Story 126. Mistborn and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. I got the first book later. Story 127. If I remember correctly, it started with some Peanuts books. Then my mom would give me $5 a week as allowance to buy comic books. They cost 25 cents back then, so I would buy many titles. I became a voracious reader after that. Story 128. Charlotte's Web. I cried my little eyes out, but couldn't put it down. Story 129. Choose Your Own Adventures. When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. The Girl with Silver Eyes. Story 130. My mom would not buy me books. I had 3 books that I was allowed to read and write reports about daily, so reading felt like a punishment. Story 131. I read Little House in the Big Woods when I was in kindergarten. Story 132. I can help you. Search YouTube for Horrid Henry and start watching it so you can understand it better. Story 133. Robinson Crusoe. I was 10. Story 134. Children's Bible. Little Golden Books. Sweet Valley High. Story 135. I think the Decameron series. I do not remember the specific book. Story 136. I read a lot of Sidney Sheldon as a kid because my older sisters read his books and I would pick them up. Story 137. 1984 thematically centers on the consequences of totalitarianism, mass surveillance, and the repressive regimentation of people and behavior within society. Story 138. Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari actually sparked an interest that eventually led me to earn my master's degree. Story 139. The Harry Potter series was the first time I literally could not put down a book. After reading the entire series, I realized that I love reading. Story 140. Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie taught me that I enjoy period novels and mysteries. Edited to add. I was probably around 12 or 13. It escalated from there. Story 141. I read Prince Caspian, followed shortly by The Hobbit and Watership Down. My aunt had them in her bookcase and was quite miffed when I told her how wonderful they were, since she is a devout Jehovah's Witness who thought fantasy smacked of the devil. Story 142. Poison Study. I thought reading sucked for a long time, but in high school I read Poison Study and was immediately entranced. I read the entire series, 6 books at the time, in a couple of weeks. I read 2 of them in just under 3 days. Story 143. I read Jurassic Park about 4 years ago. It got me back into reading in a big way. Story 144. A Time to Kill by John Grisham. I was 23 and had just moved into a new place but did not have cable or internet yet and was bored with my digital versatile discs. I borrowed a book from a friend and decided to read one night. I was hooked and have been a constant reader for the past 17 years. I had read occasionally while growing up, but reading for pleasure as an adult is a whole different experience than being forced to read in school. Story 145. I read The Outsiders in middle school and I branched off from there into other authors and genres. Story 146. I found The Sixth Sword of Shannara book in a bag in my house. It reignited my love of reading when I was 16 and introduced me to fantasy. Story 147. Warriors by Aaron Hunter. I am still reading the series. Story 148. Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransom. An engaging series set in the Lake District of the United Kingdom. It felt very real to me. Children my age, 10 years old, sailing and having pirate adventures, with genuine emotions that made the story vivid. Story 149. The Beverly Cleary and Judy Blume books were great. The Ramona Quimby series was especially enjoyable. Story 150. Most of my earliest memories involve sitting on a beanbag chair in my closet next to all my books and reading for hours. I could not tell you any specifics. Laughing out loud. Story 151. I read the first Harry Potter book in one sitting, not getting up to do anything. I was completely immersed. Story 152. My father had a large collection of old science fiction, so I read all of Heinlein, Niven, Pournelle, and Asimov at a young age. This kicked off a lifelong passion for science fiction. Story 153. Gregor the Overlander series. The first book enthralled me with the mystery of an unknown world. I've been chasing that feeling ever since. Story 154. I did not know the name, but it was about ancient Egypt. Until then, I had fought against properly learning to read. It turned out I was dyslexic, but I also had this strange idea that if you could read, they would keep you inside forever. There was a big book on ancient Egypt. Could tell the teacher was skipping parts, and a few of us became convinced she was withholding the good stuff. So I borrowed the book from her desk one lunchtime and held court in the playground, reading in detail the whole process of mummification, including how they remove the brain through the nose. Story 155. I do not know. My mother read to me nightly, and by the time I started first grade, I was well ahead of my classmates. I have read daily without fail. I remember that in grade school, I was enthralled with the 3 Investigators series. Story 156. The first titles that come to mind as inspiring more reading for my younger self are a very Generation X collection. Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline L'Engle, and Charlotte's Web by Elwyn Brooks White. I just confirmed I still have the 3 childhood physical copies on my living room shelves. They are more than 40 years old. Story 157. I still remember an elementary school teacher who spoke about the benefits of reading. I am very grateful to her. A popular science book, The Principle of Everything, covers a wide range of fascinating topics. I became immersed in it, and after reading it I discovered what I truly enjoy. Story 158. The Call of the Wild. It is the first book I read cover to cover. I would come home from school and read it in bed until I fell asleep. It is a very special book for me, and it started my passion for reading. Story 159. I completely fell in love with the character Ponyboy in The Outsiders. It was the first time I realized that book characters can feel like friends, and as a lonely, emotional teenager, I was sold. Story 160. The books by Jean Platti about royalty, from William the Conqueror to Queen Victoria, taught me so much and helped me earn great grades on school essays and at quiz nights. Story 161. My dad gave me The Color Wizard. I still have it. He is dead. Story 162. Harry Potter, 100%. It is my favorite book series, and I am an active member of the fandom. It keeps me happy, teaches me a lot, and has helped me make friends. Story 163. For me, it was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. It was the first time a book made me lose track of time. I would stay up well past my bedtime just to see what happened next. After that, I was hooked on reading for life. Story 164. A childhood favorite hooked me. After that, I could not stop devouring books. Story 165. When I was 9 years old, I read the series of Unfortunate Events. I have been a reader ever since. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.